a wonderful we have a wonderful new experiment. We are zooming into our lecture hall. So not only are you able to enjoy this lecture from the comfort of your own home, you could go to the Institute with Dr. Lombardo and a hearty group of souls in the 65-degree temperature, but we have hot coffee. Um, there's enthusiasts that want to see it live on the big screen. For those of you in the lecture hall, please make sure you silence your telephones. Your emergency exits are behind you and through the fire escape in front of you by the passenger pigeons. And in terms of Zoom etiquette, please mute your microphones, hold your questions until the end of the presentation, and you can pin the speaker if you're able to do that with your technical proficiency. A few developments around the Institute. We are continuing to make progress. I'm feeling that the Institute is changing its state of being. There's actually room to put things now. There's a better understanding of our collections and the environment that we need to keep our collections in. We have a few months kind of off where we'll just host school groups and get through the winter time, and then we're going to have a very active spring. We're going to participate in the Delco Extraordinary Give. So be on the lookout for that. We'll be asking for donations from our membership as well as the broader public. We had a fantastic outpouring of support last year, which I think raised over $4,000. And I think they were several $1,000,000 raised for nonprofits in Delaware County. In addition, Williamson Trade School is going to be coming back. We have a wonderful several days with the young folks there, sort of getting them involved in how to provide proper TLC to old buildings and getting them involved with electrical work, moving things, installing floors. And of course, it is a service opportunity. So if any folks want to come and get their hands dirty, they're welcome to do that as well. Again, I'd just like to encourage you to support the Institute any way possible, financial, emotional, volunteer-wise, otherwise, we accept it all. That brings us to sort of this evening. I did not introduce myself, but I am Jeremiah Fioravanti. I'm one of the volunteers and the president of the Delaware County Institute of Science. I teach for Harrisburg Area Community College, which means I was aware of a university very close to our main campus, at Harrisburg University, with a lot of focus on science research. We're starting to send students there. We're starting to see a lot of exciting things develop from that university. It came to my attention. They had a specialist in dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are always a hot topic, which many people enjoy at our institution. So this led to the collaboration to request Dr. Jasinski to come and present tonight on T-Rex. A brief look at his bio. It looks like he spent some time at Penn State and the University of Pennsylvania, and he works on these wonderful, beasts from the ancient past. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jasinski to the lecture.
Well, thank you for having me. I assume it is my turn to now move forward. Okay. So again, thank you for having me. I'm Dr. Stephen Jasinski. I work on dinosaurs and lots of other ancient creatures, I suppose, evolution and things along those lines. And so today we're going to be kind of focusing in on some of the work I've done, both with T-Rex, but kind of an overarching thing with, I suppose, T-Rex's kind of extended family. So with that, we will get started and go from there. So hopefully you can see, the screen without too much difficulty. Having said that, let's kind of jump in, and I'll try to avoid some of the more technical aspects, even though I will touch on those just and kind of as an overarching kind of idea. But the concept is that we have a really good handle, or at least we think we do, on T-Rex. It's a dinosaur that everyone knows colloquially really well. It's a very common thing to use for outreach and things along those lines. But it turns out that we don't necessarily have as good a handle on its evolution as we think we did or may have in the past. So having said that, again, I'm at Harrisburg University, and it gives me a good opportunity to kind of work forward with what we have. I'll quickly throw out some acknowledgments. There's lots of other researchers, the research team we work with, co-authors, people at various universities and museums that have all taken part and helped out with this research in one way or another. We have lots of ongoing projects. And so there's lots of different things that are kind of attached to this. But let's move past that rather quickly and get into maybe the more of the gridded information that we want with these. So we'll start out with the idea of T-Rex being this major group of dinosaurs, or within this major group of dinosaurs, called the theropods or theropoda. And they're more of one of the more well-known aspects, partially because of T-Rex and partially because a lot of other famous dinosaurs fall into this group, right? They're bipedal, they walk on just their hind legs. They are mainly carnivorous. We think of them as the carnivorous dinosaurs, but there's actually members who are omnivorous and possibly herbivorous as well. And we think of them as some of the earliest dinosaurs. Here we have an image of Coelophysis, a relatively well-known theropod dinosaur in that lower left-hand corner. But you see the systematics on the right-hand side of your screen. And within this, we get this better idea of the variation within this group. Now, the goal is not to necessarily pick everything out from this, but you see some of the things at the top, like the Herrerasaurids, and Daimonosaurus, Coelophysoids are there as well that you can see kind of up close to the top in this generalized area. We have ceratosaurs, which you may know, and there's things like Spinosaurids and Allosaurids and Allosauroids that are on there as well. But the key is to kind of focus in on that lower half where we get some of the more derived types of theropods, and within that, you might see the marking for Coelurosaurs about a third of the way down. Within Coelurosaurs, we have the Tyrannosaurids, and that's really where we're kind of focusing in on here with this group of theropod dinosaurs that reached incredibly large sizes. Now, we may discuss or mention Spinosaurs and Spinosaurids later on as dinosaurs that maybe got to a similar length. But as far as the robustness, the size, the weight, things like that, the Tyrannosaurids really kind of took over as that largest terrestrial carnivore that we know about. So within Tyrannosauroids, the superfamily of these gigantic theropod dinosaurs, right? This group contains both Tyrannosaurus rex, but also things that are related to it that all have maybe a similar body shape, but they've changed sizes throughout their evolution. So they don't all start out at that same size. Maybe unsurprisingly, they started out in much smaller size range in Laurasia, right? So Laurasia, during the time when we had supercontinents and we had Pangea breaking up as a supercontinent, that's the northern continents. That includes North America, it includes Europe, and it includes Asia. So we have these northern theropod dinosaurs, these northern carnivorous terrestrial animals, and they really start showing up as far back as the middle Jurassic. So that's pushing us back closer to, say, 170 million years ago, which means that their earliest portion started at that point in time. They move forward through the end of the Cretaceous, and they have about 100 million years to evolve and change sizes, change some of their morphology, their shape, their behavior, things like that. And so you get a smattering kind of the array of some of the Tyrannosauroids over there on the right. And we'll go through some of these in a little more depth, but not all of them, but just touching on the way we see the line that leads to Tyrannosaurus rex, how that changes, right, throughout their evolutionary history. And so within Tyrannosaurids, again, we're within this large superfamily. We're starting out in the middle Jurassic, and we have the kind of the sister family of theropod dinosaurs that are Tyrannosauroids, but for the most part very clearly different, and they're the Proceratosaurids. Within this group, they're again present in that Laurasian supercontinent, so those northern continents, basically North America, Europe, Russia, and Asia. And these are oftentimes a lot smaller in size. They have relatively longer arms, which is a kind of a trend we will see change throughout their evolutionary work. But they start out in much smaller sizes with arms that we consider normal for the overarching group of what we call Coelurosaurian theropods. Again, Coelurosaurians include things like Dromaeosaurids, the raptors that we know, Velociraptor, Utahraptor, Deinonychus, and a couple others. So Having said that, they have relatively longer arms, and we're not seeing the super short arms yet within this group. But one of the major things that we're finding with some of these members are that we're seeing some important features that we don't necessarily see or don't have evidence of later on. So within the Proceratosaurids, we have members with hair, or not hair, feathers. So if you think of Tyrannus, if you know things about evidence of feathers in Tyrannosaurids or Tyrannosauroids, that's where we get it. A member from Asia that's found to have simple kind of proto feathers, but feathers present on a fairly large size theropod, something close to, say, 20 feet long, which is big for that kind of thing. We also get headgear. We get more complicated aspects of what's going on in the skulls of these dinosaurs. And so it's not surprising to see crests and things like that. Here we have Proceratosaurus on the right. You can see the skull that was actually collected in the top. You can see an extension of basically the nasals at the front of that skull. And then the reconstructions tell us or help convey what we think of. Now that might seem like it's, a lot of pushing the envelope for what we actually have evidence for, but we have other members within this group, Dialong and Guanlong. So Proceratosaurus is a European member. Dialong and Guanlong are Tyrannosauroids, Proceratosaurids with distinct headgear similar to this that we collect and have collected in Asia. We have evidence for these with kind of a more distinct features of the skull, but they're relatively small. Things closer to the raptors in Jurassic Park size animals. Maybe a little bit larger, but not by a whole lot. We move past the Proceratosaurids and we move more into the group that's closer to what we're actually getting. So we're still in Tyrannosauroids. We're not quite into the proper family Tyrannosauridae, but we're getting close. These members tend to have smaller body sizes. They still have those relatively longer and larger forelimbs, so the actual arms themselves. The maxilla, the bone at the top of the skull that has the majority of the teeth, the upper teeth for these animals, ends up being more kind of robust than what we saw before. And the teeth are getting a little bit larger too. So we're starting to see small trends toward what we're looking for. Here we have a early member from about 120 million years ago in Western China on Zhangguanlong. And you see the actual skull in the upper portion. It looks heavily crushed. There is, taphonomic deformation going on there as far as changes due to the fossilization process. But kind of the reconstruction shows you that these have a longer, kind of lower skull. Still doesn't look that much like T-Rex, but we're trending in that direction. We get another member here, then, and you can see where the eye is up there as far as the crushing of the skull is concerned, based on the rest of the skull, right? We move forward a little bit. We get to about 90 million years ago. Here we're getting into the early Cretaceous period. We move through the Jurassic, and we get things like Susquityrannus from New Mexico. These still tend to be relatively smaller size, but again, slightly longer forelimbs and larger forelimbs, more robust maxillae, and relatively larger teeth. And again, a lot of the material, the fossils we have are not spectacular, but we use these and compare them to other things we have to make sure we have a fair handle on what we're looking at, what we think these look like. And so Susquityrannus kind of gives an idea based off of related animals, what we can see of as this early Tyrannosaurid, or at least basal Tyrannosaurid that's not quite within the proper family. Now, as we get to the actual family itself, we start seeing things growing much larger. So we're starting to see larger sizes. The skulls, you can see in Appalachiosaurus here, you can see that skull becoming a little bit deeper. You're getting more area for muscle attachment, so stronger, bigger skulls themselves. Those more robust skulls house more robust teeth. And there's been a lot of question then as to whether the arms had already started to shrink at this time or not. Within this reconstruction, you can see from the McWane Science Center, which was one of the earliest reconstructions for Appalachiosaurus, you can see really, really long forelimbs. If you're not certain, take my word for it, those are incredibly long forelimbs for a tyrannosaur. And it was thought then that this showed an early concept where these tyrannosaurs, early ones, kept longer forelimbs and longer arms. But this has been kind of redone and looked at. it was determined that part of the issue was a misidentification of some of the bones themselves that were originally thought to be the humerus, so the upper arm bone. Now it's shown that that was actually part of the pelvis. That does happen when the material is incredibly complete and we're only getting fragments or pieces. So it does happen even to the best of paleontologists. But when it was then reconstructed and shown what the actual proportions were, you can see here in the lower portion a more up-to-date reconstruction, an up-to-date version. This one's from a science center in Georgia called the Tellus Science Center. You can see a more accurate rendition of shorter forelimbs. So we're having shorter forelimbs now. The forelimbs are kind of relatively smaller compared to the rest of the animal as we're getting slightly larger sizes. Now, because it wouldn't be proper to miss a major member of this that goes into account or takes into account something much closer, we'll mention the idea of Dryptosaurus as well. So Dryptosaurus is the Tyrannosauroid known from New Jersey from the late Cretaceous. This happens to be very late Cretaceous, depending on what the stratigraphy is kind of coming down as. But having said that, there was discussion on longer forelimbs for Dryptosaurus as well, suggesting a distinctly different animal. But they've kind of re-looked at some of the elements for this, re-looked at some of the elements for Dryptosaurus. Even here, the arms look a little bit longer. But it turns out that what we actually are probably seeing with Dryptosaurus is that the arms themselves are not overly long, but it did have larger hands. Okay, the actual manus itself, the hands, and the claws were a bit longer. Now that's more distinct than with just within the realm of what we see, normal morphology, normal size, shape, that kind of thing for tyrannosauroids. So again, not longer arms, just slightly bigger hands, probably dealing with either a distinction on early evolutionary changes or behavioral implications for why you need slightly longer or larger hands. With a body this size, you normally wouldn't be anything extreme. But again, Dryptosaurus, not an extremely large tyrannosaurid, and it's not distinguished enough to be within one of the major groups of tyrannosaurids that will kind of follow. So, having said that, right, we have this idea of what's happening with tyrannosaurids. So what you see here is a phylogenetic tree. It's one of the ways that we try to show evolutionary relationships between organisms and taxa and species and animals, plants, etc. Within that, there's a lot of names you probably don't recognize, maybe some names you do within this, but this is the Tyrannosauridae. So this is the proper, more extreme family that we're looking at. Okay, so within this proper family, the things that I want to kind of focus on is that on the bottom is a timeline. That timeline is showing you when these taxa, when these species and these tyrannosaurs are alive. Okay, orange on the far right is the Paleogene. That's after the KT mass extinction. So that's after we no longer have any dinosaurs. And you'll see some taxa getting right up to that line. Things like T-Rex, you can see coming up right to that KPG line. The other ones all happen a little bit earlier than that. Oftentimes, you'll see within that green block in the middle, that's the Cretaceous. The late or upper Cretaceous is on the right side of that. And most things are present at the end of that. You're going to see a lot of little circles telling you that a lot of species are present at the end of the Cretaceous or in that late Cretaceous period. So there's a radiation of these gigantic theropod dinosaurs all occurring late within the Cretaceous period, right before that mass extinction. Within the last, say, 10 or so million years, up to that 66.5 deadline that we have before we lose them. Pretty much all derived tyrannosaurids are from North America and Asia. That's not because we are missing rocks that could have them in other areas. It's because they were not in other areas. They are a northern type of dinosaur. The southern portions of the world were maintained by other large theropods. They still had gigantic theropod dinosaurs, but not anything closely related to T-Rex. So these all happen in those last two major periods in the Cretaceous, what we call the Campanian and the Maastrichtian. Those are when we have this large radiation. The Maastrichtian being the very end of the Cretaceous, right as we get to that last portion. Now, if we zoom in a little bit to what we consider the actual Tyrannosauridae family here, What I want to kind of focus then is some of these major groups within this family, because all of those then are going to kind of be relatively important to understand. Some of them are more stable than others, which means we have a better handle on the members, the features, where they're at, what they were doing, compared to some other groups. But I will also mention is that the color of those circles tells you where these dinosaurs are from. Everything in red is from Asia. The ones that are light blue and dark blue are from North America. Dark blue is northern North America, what we call northern Laramidia. And I'll explain what Laramidia is, right? If you don't know, that's fine. But then that light blue is southern Laramidia. So there's a north-south difference in the members that we have, and to a point, a far east versus far west with North America versus Asia going on within these. And so within these major groups, we have a couple tribes and subfamilies, just clades or groups that kind of focus in together within Tyrannosaurids. They include the Aleoramini, Albertosaurinae, Tyrannosaurinae. Within Tyrannosaurinae, we have things like the Spletosaurini and Tyrannosaurinae. So a couple major groups within that. So if we start out with talking about each of these groups rather quickly to get a handle on kind of what might be happening, let's move into the idea of the Aleoramini. So the Aleoramini is this group of Asian tyrannosaurs, really basal tyrannosaurids. They include Giangiolosaurus and Aleoramus. Within these, we have tyrannosaurids that are relatively small within Tyrannosauridae, this major family that we're really focusing in on now. Okay, these are smaller compared to most of the other predators and animals within that. They got to about 7 meters long, so think 20 or so feet in that, something in that general range. And they got to up to about 750 kilograms, so less than half a ton, but they're kind of getting into that area. But they had a distinctly different skull set up because it's lower, because it's longer. It also means it's not as strong. It's more gracile, it's less robust. And so they're probably utilizing that to hunt other things. This is still late Cretaceous. They're still present with other gigantic theropods that are crushing things, but these are not going to be dinosaurs that are crushing things, right? They're probably going to be maybe a little bit faster, maybe a little bit more active as far as predation is concerned, less crushing things, more snapping, getting things rather quickly, something along those lines. So this is one of the early groups we have that kind of separates itself out distinctly with a couple species. Within the ones we know a little bit more about, okay, one of those is the subfamily Albertosaurinae, and that includes Albertosaurus and Gorgosaurus. And whether those are two distinct genera or whether they're actually the same has been up for debate. For the most part, we're relatively confident that they are two distinct different types, distinct enough to be considered different genera. These are more, compared to T-Rex, these are more gracile, they're relatively lighter built, they have shorter skulls, not nearly as long, kind of snout to the back of the skull. They also have different leg proportions, okay, which by different hind leg proportions, you take the femur, the upper leg bone, and the tibia, the major part of the lower leg, not including what's happening with the foot, and the tibia is longer comparatively. What that suggests is that these animals were more active and faster than T-Rex and its close relatives. But we're getting bigger than the Aleoramines. Okay, these are about 9 meters long, so we're getting up closer to those mid 20s to upper 20 feet long, closer to something like 30. We're getting up over a ton now, okay, 2,500 kilograms or so. These also were known to live beside the more robust tyrannosaurids. So we've found in the same formations, in the same areas, that these lived with some of the larger, kind of stronger ones. I'll mention the Spletosauris here in a second, but things like the Spletosauris lived potentially alongside Albertosaurus and things along those lines. So how do you have two large predators living beside each other? Chances are there is niche partitioning, they're utilizing different resources, or there's just enough resources that they don't have to fight to utilize the ones that are there. So there's things along those lines. These were more lightly built, but there's also potential ideas on them living in packs based off of some fossil localities. We have found multiple individuals together dying at the same time at multiple size levels and therefore multiple ages, multiple ontogenetic stages, with whether they were juveniles, subadults, adults, geriatric old individuals. Because of that, there's the idea that at least some of them utilized this pack behavior and maybe could take down larger prey because of that. So maybe they're able to compete with large, robust individuals if you're a little bit smaller, but faster and you have a lot of you working together. Okay? Now, we move to the other subfamily, not Aleorhamini, not Albertosaurinae, but what we consider the most derived subfamily within this, the Tyrannosaurinae. So now we're getting much closer to T-Rex. These are the largest. They seem to have the most changes to their morphology, the shape, the size, what they're doing, therefore considered the most derived. Again, northern continents, North America and Asia, these get really robust, large skulls. So we're lengthening that skull out, we're deepening it, and we're making it really, really big. This provides the ability to have a lot more musculature present. They also tend to get far more robust teeth, which means that the bite forces that we're seeing, what they're able to do is getting to a more extreme level. But within this group, we have some, again, in North America and Asia, but we have a lot more variety, it seems, in North America than Asia. There might be reasons for that, dealing with the idea of an incomplete fossil record or the ability to have more endemism, which I'll mention again in a little bit later, but something is clearly going on that is suggesting or showing this happening. So we're in Tyrannosaurinae. Let's break it down to the two tribes, basically two clades that are called tribes phylogenetically within this group. We start out with the Daspletosaurinae, okay, that has Daspletosaurus and Tyrannosaurus, which might be Daspletosaurus as well. Again, similar to Albertosaurus, Gorgosaurus, there's debate as far as how differentiated they are. But then this completely North American group, super robust skulls, really, really thickly built, really large dinosaurs. We're getting bigger than Albertosaurines. Okay, now we're getting up to 10 meters, so we're getting up well over 30 feet, potentially, 35 feet long or so, which is getting to the extreme levels the dinosaurs get. You're looking at things that are 3,000, 4,000 kilograms, so up closer to 2 tons, okay? And if you look at the lower image that we have right there, you see some of the sizes that we're looking at compared to people. This is getting really, really large. Tyrannosaurus is that lower one in the smallest one in the right-hand side. Whether that's just a young individual or size difference is more debatable. But again, Daspletosaurus here is living beside other large theropods. It's living beside Albertosaurus. We have these large theropods dealing with each other on a pretty consistent basis. There's also been discussion as to whether we find anagenesis within the evolution of these dinosaurs. Anagenesis talks about the idea of having one organism or species change and evolve directly into another one. So say you basically have conditions change within that evolutionary population. Those dinosaurs, those individual organisms are going to deal with those changes in a direct format, and therefore you're going to have one species present, and then over time, that one species, you're going to see morphologically it change into another species over a given number of years, whether that's thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands, or millions. You're going to see a direct change from one to another. That's different from an evolutionary line where you see things change and you see one species with the population splitting, and then you get two different variations of morphology present. And maybe those two dinosaur species live beside each other for a little while. Maybe one outcompetes the other one. All of those are possibilities, but there's been discussion back and forth significantly about whether this is happening with Daspletosaurus. Still up in the air. We still get ongoing research. The last several years has seen a paper or two papers come out every year back and forth within this debate. So we're not getting into that right now. It's just a thing that we're looking into. Let's get into the last major group then within Tyrannosaurs, within this derived line. Here we have the Tyrannosaurinae. This is that last clade, and this includes Tyrannosaurus, right, the one that we are really focusing in on, but it also includes two very closely related taxa, Tarbosaurus and Tutangaranus. Within that, the latter two are both Asian species. Tyrannosaurus then is that one North American member within this. These are gigantic animals. They are by far the most robust of all these tyrannosaurs. They have gigantic skulls. They are massively built. There is muscle attachment all over these things. And because of that, we see much, much larger sizes. Now we're getting into that 12 to 13 meter range. So now you're looking at things up close to 40 or so feet long, right? So we gain several extra feet, but maybe the biggest difference in size between things like the Spinosaurus or the Spinosaurs and Tyrannosaurs is the massive amount of weight and robustness within the skeleton. So here, the Spinosaurines are something like 4,000 kilograms. We're doubling that. We're getting something closer to 8,000 kilograms. Putting that into a kind of a context, male elephants, the largest male elephants, are normally in the 6,000 range. So it's not like we're several elephants large. But for large theropods, this is gigantic. We're getting up in that 8,000 range, 4 tons or so, maybe a little bit more, depending on who you talk to. We get an idea of the size of this with a relatively recent kind of reconstruction, a life reconstruction of Sioux that you see down there at the bottom. I would suggest that the size of things like that tail are probably a little bit too extreme. That's probably, it was a huge tail, probably a little bit too much meat on that. You probably want to shrink that down a little bit, but regardless, you get an idea of the size. These things are massive. So if we have that, there's been lots of discussion as to whether things like Tarbosaurus is really a species of Tyrannosaurus, whether Jucheng tyrannus is a species of Tyrannosaurus, and whether the genus Tyrannosaurus is just all over North America and Asia, all over the northern continents at this point in time. That's been heavily debated, which means we've had a hard time figuring out what actually led to T-Rex, right? If we have things that are far older, hey, those things, those small things like Susky tyrannus, how do we get from something like that to actual T-Rex, this gigantic meat-eating machine at the end of the Cretaceous? So we focus in on T-Rex, and we know that there are many specimens described of T-Rex. There is just a ton all over the place. And these specimens, not counting Tarbosaurus, not counting the Asian versions and whether that's actually Tyrannosaurus or not, still up for debate. Mostly considered not, but some individual scientists and researchers still consider that the case. We have things that have been identified as T-Rex from Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada, and throughout the U.S. there's lots. Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Colorado, all of those slightly more northern states all have lots of specimens, sometimes highly incomplete, but lots of specimens identified as T-Rex. And then there's also been some identified from more southern states. Utah has specimens identified as T-Rex, New Mexico does, Texas does as well. So lots of individual specimens all consider that. Essentially, T-Rex has become or is a garbage taxon. A taxon that basically, if there is any large tyrannosaur, any large carnivorous or theropod dinosaur collected at the end of the Cretaceous, it's considered to be T-Rex. What this means is that there is a huge need for us to look back at these specimens and ensure that those original referrals are correct and that we're not moving in a direction where everything is, so that no matter what, it's all T-Rex. So what this led to was a project that's we've been moving through that's re-describing and re-identifying a lot of these early specimens. And so one of the a really important one is one that is from the end of the Cretaceous, or at least late Cretaceous, in New Mexico. Now, within this, okay, we're going to talk some ideas about the specimen itself, about its age, about how it is distinct from T-Rex, and how this changes our thinking of Tyrannosaurs in general, how it pushes that around, and what that means for other things we've identified as T-Rex moving forward. So, in the 1980s, there was some work being done in central New Mexico, well, west central New Mexico, but central New Mexico essentially, in a formation called the Hall Lake Formation. It used to be called the McRae Formation. Now it's the McRae Group. We can get into stratigraphy later on, but it doesn't really matter. It's a set of basically rocks within western and central New Mexico, and it shows an inland terrestrial environment. The issue is that a lot of specimens are not preserved very well, and it's not as fossiliferous as some other areas like the San Juan Basin in northwestern New Mexico. So people haven't collected there as much, and it's been ignored more. But you can see some of the sediment and the rocks on the right-hand side. Even if you don't do a lot with geology, hopefully you can kind of see that a lot of those look like they're kind of broken down. There's a lot of kind of silt. It looks like it's very, very fine grain and doesn't hold together very well, which means it doesn't preserve very well. But we do get some fossils from there. Here is a femur, the upper leg bone of a hadrosaur, one of the duck-billed dinosaurs. And maybe you can see that it doesn't look like much other than a weird rock, or if you know anatomy, maybe you think it looks like a really, really incomplete femur. Okay? Now, having said that, this ends up being an important aspect because it's relatively complete and it's really, really large. But this gives you an idea of the kind of fossils we are finding in the Whole Lake Formation and kind of the degree to how well preserved they are or not. So in the 1980s, Dave Gillette and a group who were doing collecting there found a very, very large lower jawbone for a tyrannosaur. They found a couple other pieces of the skull too, and based off the size and general ideas, it was immediately identified as T-Rex, which is important. We got a really large specimen of T-Rex now from New Mexico. That's great. But some other researchers and I thought we should look back at that. So, having said that, we looked back at it, and part of the issue was that it was considered T-Rex because it was big and because the Whole Lake Formation was considered really, really young, basically at the end of the Cretaceous. So here we have dinosaurs identified from there, and all of these, T-Rex, Torosaurus, Edmontosaur, like duck-billed dinosaur, Alamosaurus, a sauropod, are all considered taxa from the end of the Cretaceous. So that suggests what we consider biostratigraphically, okay, the biology within that stratigraphy, that this is a Lancian, a end of the Cretaceous assemblage, and makes sense then that T-Rex is alive at the end of the Cretaceous. But is that true or not? We looked back at the ceratopsid, the horned and frilled dinosaur, okay, that we called Torosaurus, a taxon, a species known from the end. And we got pieces of the skull. So here we have a parietal, basically the middle back part of the frill, the jugal, kind of like the cheekbone. And we looked back to see how that compares with other ceratopsids. In doing that, we determined that it was distinct. We named it Sierraceratops turneri because it is not Torosaurus. Why is that important? Because we did not know when Sierraceratops would have been alive, but we did know when Torosaurus would have been alive, right? So, having said that, we need to adjust what we're looking at. So, we looked back, and several spots within this stratigraphy, within these rock layers, have been dated. And we get dates like 75, 74.9, 75.2, and 73.2 million years old, plus or minus anywhere from less than to just over a million years. This is important because if you look at this stratigraphic chart, these layers of rocks, you'll see Sierraceratops, you'll see the Tyrannosaur, you'll see that sauropod Titanosaur up there. So we don't have an exact date above and below these fossils. That's an issue. But we've done work to look at sedimentation rates, how quickly sediment is falling within this range, and we find no disconformities, no layers that seem to be missing, eroded away, anything like that, suggesting a huge amount of time has changed or been altered. And what this states is that within that sedimentation rate, assuming that we aren't missing something, we don't believe we are, that puts the age of these dinosaurs, Sierraceratops, the Tyrannosaur itself, something in the 73 to just over 71 million year range. That's important because T-Rex is known at the end of the Cretaceous at 66 and a half. Maybe you can pull it up to 67, maybe even 68, but you're still several million years difference in age. That's very important for determining how different these things can be, even though that doesn't tell us anything about how it's different in shape. So we look back at, again, that jaw itself. We try to get a better idea. As I mentioned, that jaw is very similar in size to other big T-Rexes we have. A lot of people know Sue as the big T-Rex from the Field Museum in Chicago. We're on a similar size scale to that. The type of T-Rex at the Carnegie Museum, again, a very similar size. So we have a really large animal. But do features on it suggest it is not the same as T-Rex? We'll go through these rather quickly because it's a little bit technical and you don't necessarily want to get into the anatomy too much. Okay? But you look at the lower jaws, and the top A is always going to be the Tyrannosaur that we're talking about. All the other specimens are T-Rex. So you look at things such as this lower jaw, and hopefully you can see that this lower jaw kind of curves up at that back part of that lower jaw, whereas all of the other T-Rex specimens curve down, which is a distinct feature from what we consider T-Rex. You look at things such as aspects of other elements within this, and we still see differences. So we'll get into this, or we'll move through this rather quickly because this is new material that was collected, not utilized when they first looked at these specimens. You look at things like the post-orbital, that's the spot directly after and above the eye of these tyrannosaurs. Again, A is the Hall Lake Tyrannosaur, everything else is T-Rex. Here we get things like the post-orbital has a hook down, it's hooked down anteriorly. It has a lower boss. That's that kind of, it would be the horn that you see on T-Rex above the eye. There's a little bump above the eye. It's lower in this Hall Lake specimen. Okay, and you can see that in this fossil comparing these different things. Similarly, if you turn it around, you still see those same features being distinct from T-Rex. You get the squamosal, that's a bone at the back part of the skull, kind of behind at the very, very upper back part of the skull. You get a process there that ends up being thinner and ventrally directed down, okay, would be ventrally. You get other aspects like a curvature within that same feature being more distinctly curved than any T-Rex specimen we have. The splenial, again, a feature within the lower jaw itself. Here you're looking at that being directed in a different way, a different shelf overhang. Again, subtle features, but distinct features that are different. The prearticular, again, a portion in the back part of that lower jaw. Here, being less bent, less distinctly curved, less of an angle than we see with T-Rex. You look at the angular itself, it has a distinctly different aspect of the articular surface, basically where it attaches the splenial. Again, the angular being part of that lower jaw. The articular, that's where the lower jaw itself connects with the upper skull. Basically, it's again a different process. On the left, A and D are basically this whole like Tyrannosaur. You can see it being quadrangle shaped, so kind of a square-ish, rectangular-ish, and a more thin aspect when you look at it from behind. So underneath, so a ventral view looking up at it. So again, all of these features, not hugely different, but all of these features are different than all the other T-Rex specimens we know, which shows a consistent change in its shape, size, and morphology. So again, we have these subtle features that are suggesting differences. Here we have Tyrannosaurus and Tarbosaurus, two distinctly different genera. And the same differences that we're seeing between Tyrannosaurus and Tarbosaurus, Rex and Batar, we're seeing the same kind of changes at the same levels within this Tyrannosaur. All of this is suggesting that it's a distinctly different species. Not super distinct, but still different from Tyrannosaurus Rex in every way that we're coming up with to show that. If we look at this, kind of how it compares within these taxa, okay, we look at where this lies, and it's in red at the bottom of that. And what I really want to show here is if you look at the bottom of this tree, okay, you'll see this new taxon, you'll see it still groups right beside T-Rex. It suggests that it's similar, okay? They're what we call sister species, but it still is distinctly different. So within that, with that being the case, we ran it several different ways. To do a phylogeny, to run a phylogenetic analysis, you take lots of features, lots of different characteristics of organisms, the shape of the bones and everything else like that, and you compare them within lots of different taxa. And you run a computer analysis on the similarities and differences. The more similarities there are, the closer they are in this phylogenetic tree. The more differences, the further away they are. So if they're closer to each other, that means there's less differences in their size and shape and the morphology, which suggests that they're more closely related. So we have something closely related to T-Rex, but not T-Rex. close enough that it is another species, but not the same species. Now, this is a different way of looking at these analyses. Bayesian tip-based analysis basically looks at making assumptions for how things are related and looking at that. I'm not going to delve into this too much, but it allows us to look at those. That, again, that red mark up there is this new Tyrannosaur. Again, it's sister, it's directly related to, tied most closely to T-Rex. But what this allows us to do is this allows us to also look at things, again, biogeographically, where things are at on the Earth and what that means as far as how things are evolving and where they're evolving at. So again, this was that first phylogeny I showed a little while back. There's lots of names. They're all tiny. There's no need to try to really focus in on that necessarily. What I want to say, though, is that when you look at these colors, again, anything that's red is from Asia. Light blue is from that kind of southern North American realm. Dark blue is northern North America. The green is Europe. You'll see a little bit of that at the top. The yellow is Eastern North America. You'll see a little bit of that in the middle. So, having said that, we can focus in to figure out where these things are happening and where they're lying. So, the majority of what we see then in these derived tyrannosaurs is happening in Asia and North America. Now, if we focus in then on this lower group, we have what's called a significant Laramidian diversity. That's a wide range of taxa, of species, in what we consider Laramidia. Laramidia is when we had North America and we had the intercontinental seaway, right? A seaway breaking the continent in half. The western continent was called Laramidia. The eastern continent was called Appalachia. So, having said that, that western continent, that's where we basically know almost all the dinosaurs we know well. Triceratops, T-Rex, Stegosaurus, Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, Brontosaurus, etc. So, having said that, the vast majority are happening in Laramidia. And if we focus in on what's happening between these, again, you're going to see a fair number of dark blue dots and light blue dots right here. Those species tell you that we have groups in North America or in northern Laramidia and southern Laramidia. But what does this mean for Tyrannosaurus rex? If you look at the group leading to T-Rex, down at the bottom of that lower group, you have that Asian influence of Tarbosaurus and Jucheng tyrannus, but you also then have a vast majority of southern taxa present closer to T-Rex. We have Tyrannosaurus macraensis, that's that dinosaur we're talking about here. Lithrinax, Pistachiaversor, Teratophonius, all of those are southern tyrannosaurs. This is suggesting there's a massive radiation of tyrannosaurs in the south. The other thing to mention is that all of those dots are further left than T-Rex, which means they're all older than T-Rex. This also suggests that T-Rex is probably evolving from southern members, southern things in southern Laramidia. We're getting those large sizes several million years before T-Rex. We're getting animals the size of T-Rex several million years before T-Rex is present. And when we look now at that Hall Lake dinosaur fauna, right, now we see it as a little bit different. Now, all of a sudden, those things that we thought of as distinctly Maastrichtian, the very end of the Cretaceous, that helped point us to T-Rex, no longer maybe are present. The Ceratopsid is a different taxon. We have other members like the Titanosaur, that sauropod, might not be the same thing we thought. Tyrannosaurus macraensis is not T-Rex. Those hadrosaurs are being pushed back further too. So, this is not Maastrichtian, it's older, and we have a distinct Tyrannosaur. But what about the idea of what's happening within these? So we have macraensis, okay? Now we have this gigantic Tyrannosaur present at the end of the Cretaceous, the same size as T-Rex. We have a gigantic sauropod. T-Rex, for the most part, from what we understand, did not live with sauropods. But we had a gigantic sauropod present, one of the biggest that we know of, if it's Alamosaurus. Edmontosaurian hadrosaurs, those duck-billed dinosaurs, got to be some of the largest hadrosaurs we know, rivaling T-Rex in length, not in weight. Sierraceratops turneri, again, huge, similar in size to the gigantic ceratopsids like Torosaurus, but not Torosaurus, also older. So, what does this mean for that? We're getting a lot of really large dinosaurs in the Hall Lake dinosaur fauna. If we look at biogeography in general, southern Laramidia, again, that southern part of North America, think of Utah, New Mexico, Nevada, Mexico itself, Texas. We get a lot of large animals. Titanoceratops is one of the largest dinosaurs ever known. It may have the largest skull we've ever seen, something 9 feet long or so. Okay, and that's from New Mexico. Magnipolia is from Baja California and potentially maybe Arizona. Gigantic hadrosaur, Alamosaurus, a gigantic sauropod rivaling the biggest long-necked dinosaurs we know anywhere in the world. So what is this? Is this maybe mean that these large sizes evolved earlier than we realized? And did they evolve to the south? Okay. And what way do we have to really check that? So we have a lot of large dinosaurs living to the south. Why might that be? Right? Maybe it could be things like there's more resources to the south. We think of there being kind of more sunlight, allowing for a wider or a larger diversity of things further south. This works for cold-blooded animals. Okay, oftentimes when we think of reptiles and amphibians, you get a lot more diversity to the south. You get close to the north, you get cold temperatures, you get very, very few. But having said that, mammals tend to be a little bit different sometimes within that. Different physiologies, warm-bloodedness can affect that and not make it give the same. So is there a range of physiologies among dinosaurs? Some people think that dinosaurs were cold-blooded. A lot of people think that dinosaurs were warm-blooded. Is it more likely, and I would say yes, that there's a range of physiologies? You're not all warm-blooded, you're not all cold-blooded, you're a mixture or a range within that, and even within being warm-blooded, you're not the same degree of that as you are with other things. And there's ideas of gigantism that help maintain body heat. The larger you are, the more body heat you maintain. That works with mammals. Does it work with reptiles? No, but does it work with dinosaurs? Maybe, depending on what their physiology is. Additionally, do we have what we call strong provincialism? Does that mean that there are a lot of smaller subset areas within this continent with different resources that different animals can then utilize? Which means you get a lot of evolution in smaller pockets, changing what you see within these things happening. So let's shift slightly and just get to the idea of how many species of T-Rex are there. Is there one, Tyrannosaurus rex? Is there two now, Tyrannosaurus rex and Tyrannosaurus macraensis? Or are there more? And we'll touch on this rather briefly, but not long ago, there was two other species of Tyrannosaurus that were put forward, Tyrannosaurus imperator and Tyrannosaurus regina. And within those two sets, the idea was that there was a distinct set of three Tyrannosaurs, Rex, Imperator, and Regina. So, having said that, that's been heavily debated, and it leads to a lot of issues. For the most part, Regina is seen as being too subtle, but is Imperator, okay, a distinctly other species of Tyrannosaurus that's not Rex? There are some subtle differences. Here you can hopefully see a little bit as far as a reconstructed skull on the left and an actual skull from the American Museum in New York on the right. Things like a shorter maxilla, that's that upper bone with all the teeth in it. Shorter squamosal, again, a bone at the back of the skull. L-shaped lacrimal, a bone at the top, kind of right in front of the eye itself, and a more massive chin. All those differences might be subtle, but are they distinct enough and consistent enough to be a different species? There's the idea of what we call the Javelina tyrannosaur, and that's a tyrannosaur from the Javelina Formation in Texas. It's been discussed as being another Tyrannosaurus, but subtle differences. Again, you can see a little bit here as far as the Javelina tyrannosaur on the left and the actual T-Rex on the right. There's some subtle differences there. Are they distinct enough? Again, debatable between scientists. I won't discuss Nanotyrannus too much, but again, is Nanotyrannus legitimate? Is it a small Tyrannosaurus rex or not? Here you have things like Nanotyrannus on the bottom, an adult T-Rex on the top. Is that distinctly correct? Is it distinct? Is it a juvenile T-Rex? Is it something else? Part of the problem is that Nanotyrannus is heavily debated because there are issues with how it fits into this. And we have juveniles of Tarbosaurus, super similar to T-Rex, but they don't look like Nanotyrannus. Here on the left, you see a juvenile Tarbosaurus, and then you see Nanotyrannus on the bottom. On the right, you see an adult Tarbosaurus and an adult Tyrannosaurus. The Tarbosaurus and Tyrannosaurus look incredibly similar. While the other two look similar, there's a lot more differences present. Again, does that mean that because they were different when they were younger, they would be different when they were older, or do they are distinctly different as juveniles and then age themselves into looking and being similar as they get older adults? Again, something that is debated. Saigivenator, Molnari, again, is this Nanotyrannus? Is it something else? Something else that we look at as far as there's differences within the lower jaw, within that upper jaw, and what does that mean? Okay, and those are still things that we are debating and kind of going through. But having said that, right now, officially, there are two valid species of Tyrannosaurus, Rex and Macraensis. There are several that are considered distinctly invalid up there at the top, and there's several that are still debated, right? You see Sigivinator, you see Nanotyrannus, you see the Javelina Tyrannosaur, Imperator's both there. Again, is that valid or not? Some of it depends on the consistency for those differences. When we diagnose species, oftentimes we do that by looking for distinct, consistent differences morphologically or behaviorally between them. But we have to understand that birds are modern dinosaurs, and they lead to a lot of issues. Oftentimes, bird species are diagnosed by very subtle differences, sometimes differences in shape, in beak size, in behavior, sometimes in things that don't preserve well or at all with fossils, things like feathering, again, that behavior, calls, coloration. If you look at these two species of crow on the right, if you got these in general, very few people would be able to distinguish them, including very few paleontologists, if all you gave them was bones, especially if you only got one bone from, or one set of bones from each. How distinct are they? Those differences can be very subtle. We also are moving into a time in biology where we're learning a lot more about cryptic species. So modern species can be incredibly difficult because of things based off of things like coloration, behavior, morphology. Sometimes they are pretty much the exact same. And we use genetics to determine their distinct evolutionary pathways between these. And sometimes we get species complexes, where you look at, say, something in the middle over here on the right, and you'll see different species of Microcebus, mouse lemurs. At one point in time, they were thought to be one species. They did genetic work. They found out that that one species was 25 distinct evolutionary lines, 25 different species. It's a distinctly extreme level of this cryptic species idea. But recently, we've done it with large things like the crocodile, the slender snouted crocodile in Africa, down there at the bottom. Again, coloration seems to be pretty much the exact same, but genetics shows us that these are two distinct evolutionary lines. They don't breed anymore, they don't interbreed. They are two distinct species that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference just by looking at. So when we look at dinosaurs in general, when we focus here on tyrannosaurs, are we underestimating diversity, right? For people who are not as well versed and not diving into all the really subtle features, a lot of these things are going to look really, really similar. Early on, Marsh and Cope, right, two famous paleontologists, basically aggressively named and oversplit species like crazy, partially trying to outdo each other, partially trying for fame, trying for money, etc. Lots of reasons. But because of that, they basically named anything they found something distinct and new. And it created a mess that we're still trying to figure out. But what this means is that we took lots of species and we've been lumping them together and reducing the number of species we have. But are we overcorrecting for that? Not that we're not doing things correctly by sorting that out, but are we doing it to a more extreme where we assume that any large tyrannosaur we find in North America is T-Rex or not, right? When we look at this, we also underestimate diversity and these diversity patterns by focusing in on particular features that might be an issue or underestimating what happens in these changing times, right? When you have the Cretaceous there on the left and when you shift to the Paleogene, that's an extreme change that's easy to see. But are we still seeing a lot of species turnover without seeing that extreme thing happening within the record itself? Could this be due to an incomplete fossil record? We don't get fossils all the time everywhere. Could it be because we have a difference in the stratigraphic and basically the layer of rocks and temporally the time that we deal with and we work in, right? Species last for a particular amount of time. Different species in different groups tend to last for different amounts of time. Here you can see this idea that types of species oftentimes don't last very long. There's been lots of discussion. It's hard to determine this. Forams in this chart seem like they last for millions and millions and millions of years. But you get other things like mammals up there that maybe last for 1 million years each on average, or maybe last for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years before enough change occurs in the world that they alter their behavior, shift through morphologies to deal with those changes. When we look at dinosaurs, again, we have a problem with having an incomplete fossil record, and we deal with that. But in looking at this chart rather briefly, all I want you to notice is that a lot of those bars are really, really thin, which means a lot of those taxa, from what we can see, do not last long. And so a lot of this might be that these species durations of these dinosaurs change. Dinosaurs may have a very, very high evolutionary rate, which means they change very quickly, especially if the world's changing around them. And if other dinosaurs are evolving quickly, species A evolves quickly, species B has to evolve to deal with that, whether it's trying to avoid being eaten, whether it's to eat, whether it's just getting resources. All of those things are going to be important to look at that difference. Promise we're almost done. So, wrapping up here at the end, how do we show or try to get to this idea that dinosaurs all are evolving rapidly, and what's that turnover? Part of the issue is that we compare these dinosaurs, because they're large terrestrial animals, to the large terrestrial animals we have now, aka large mammals. But do we actually get a much lower diversity of large mammals due to things like Pleistocene hunting, right? Pleistocene overhunting, right? Whether that's officially the reason these large mammalian fauna went extinct is certainly still debated and discussed and talked about. But do we have far less? You go back thousands of years to tens of thousands to maybe a couple 100,000 years, you'll see that the diversity of proboscideans, large elephants, was vastly extreme compared to, of course, what we have now. So utilizing the modern day idea of diversity might be underestimating the ways we look at dinosaurs in the past. And so we look at tyrannosaurs and we look at this idea of T-Rex. Again, T-Rex is the most intensively studied dinosaur we have out there. It is the most well known from how we understand it. These basic problems still evolve, are still present, even when we try to look to see how we understand T-Rex and where it came from and what that means. So again, this new Tyrannosaur is giving us ideas, possibilities moving forward. We know we have a extinct Tyrannosaur that's not T-Rex. We also know that we have large sizes evolving quickly. We have Tyrannosaurus-sized things and Tyrannosaurus relatives evolving earlier than we thought and much further south than we thought. So, does this tell us that the ancestor of T-Rex is a southern thing and T-Rex itself is a migrant from the south? Certainly possible. Or are things more complicated? The only way to know for sure is to both reevaluate what we have and gather more data, more evidence, more fossils, etc. We do that and we might eventually get a much better handle on T-Rex and how it fits in this big picture. So, having said that, I am done, a little bit over the hour. Sorry about that, but we can go ahead and move to questions and anything else you may have. So, I will find that.
Dr. Jasinski, do you want to stop sharing your slides maybe for a moment and then we can
I
get the
certainly can.
in-house people here in Zoom?
I probably can. We'll do that here in a second.
While you work on the unsharing, there is a question for you in Zoom that came in right away. Lisa wants to know, did T-Rex hunt in packs?
So from what we understand, we do this. From what we understand, I'm gonna unshare. Where's unshare? We'll get there. So from what we understand with T-Rex, the basics are that it looks like younger tyrannosaurs may have actually dealt with that a little bit more. But there we go. But it looks like with adult tyrannosaurs, they probably did not deal with other members of the species in any extreme level. There's still no indication for T-Rex directly as to whether we actually have them staying together for any length of time. Part of the idea right now is that it looks like young tyrannosaurs did not have much in the way of defenses. So the concept has been that maybe adult tyrannosaurs maintained or kept care of their young for a longer period of time. But a lot of the pack behavior that we show or have shown for T-Rex actually is pack behavior for Albertosaurus. So again, a relative, but not the same dinosaur. So whether T-Rex did or not is still highly debated. I would say that there is a much better chance that it is not a universal behavior among all tyrannosaurids, but we don't have any evidence of that because we haven't found any large-scale quarries with a lot of individuals together to help convey that. We also know that there is a lot of bite marks on Tyrannosaurus specimens, especially around the face, which suggests a lot of fighting between individuals, which probably suggests not living in packs directly because that would have been far more dangerous. So they probably were not trying to be around each other with how dangerous they could be to each other.
Thank you. And if anyone else in Zoom has questions, go ahead and type them into the chat. Anthony, do you have any questions from at DCIS?
I see there's a okay. I was gonna say the basic idea around Dryptosaurus being amphibious, of course, is not really there. As far as tyrannosaurs are concerned, they would have done swimming. We've got evidence around tyrannosaur material that suggests that they were swimming at least a little bit. We have scratch marks. We have things in shallow marine environments and shallow water aqueous environments that shows that they would have been swimming. But there's nothing to suggest that they were doing more than just trying to cross a river or cross something. There's nothing to suggest that they were legitimately doing a lot of hunting, bear style, with fish or anything along those lines. We have very little in the way of coprolites that tell us exactly what dinosaurs or tyrannosaurs were eating, but we do have a couple that are large enough we think they were from tyrannosaurs, and the majority of what we find within them are really large bone chunks. Some that we've been able to identify as hadrosaurs, which suggests, not surprising, that tyrannosaurs were eating duck-billed dinosaurs, but nothing necessarily smaller.
Dr. Jasinski, this is Anthony Lombardo from the Delaware County Institute of Science, and we're streaming over here. If you don't mind, I'd like to take a question by audio from one of our members, if you may.
Sure.
This is Tim.
Steve, I have two questions. One is, maybe you answered it already in your lecture, but the forelimbs, why did they evolve to practically non-existence? The reason because it went bipedal or more bipedal or what?
So chances are we've seen this a little bit in some birds. Some birds today have shortened the wing significantly. And part of that is becoming bipedal. Part of that is the idea that you no longer need them. The idea mainly is that we see the shortening of the forelimbs coinciding relatively well with a enlarging and deepening of the skull, which basically means that they need the forelimbs less because they basically start using their mouth for almost everything. So having said that, there's not a lot of manipulation you can do, and how much dinosaurs had lips is still heavily debated, as far as not lips like ours, but lips versus something that just has the teeth kind of out there. But having said that, you get a much larger face. You no longer have to manipulate anything. They certainly didn't need that to kill anything. So if you're not really grabbing anything and you're not using it to help kill or actually do any hunting behavior, then you utilize those resources some other way. So you're automatically using something, just as deer have to grow their antlers every year, they're utilizing resources, and that's a large kind of stake on them. So if you can utilize the resources you normally would to evolve limbs, and instead switch those resources, those nutrients, those other things, to getting a larger skull, to getting more musculature, you're probably going to do that. So that's probably what's happening with the forelimbs.
And my other question is, have they found any dinosaur fossils in the rocks exposed of this age in, I believe, Antarctica? And specifically, have they found any Tyrannosaurus rex fossils?
So they do have, of course, some fossils of this end Cretaceous portion happening in Antarctica, but Antarctica is so far south that what they're really getting for the most part is not tyrannosaurs at all. They're getting some large theropods, but even the theropods are not to an extreme size, probably due to less resources being available. Therefore, you can't grow as large when you're there with less resources. So you get things like Cryolophosaurus, which is a relative of ceratosaurs and allosaurids, large theropods, but nothing T-Rex sized and nothing related to T-Rex. The only things known from the southern hemisphere that could be Tyrannosaur were some teeth found in northern South America. But teeth are very difficult to identify because there's not that much change oftentimes in what you're getting. So identifying a tooth as Tyrannosaurid or T-Rex is not the best idea. So basically, there are potential Tyrannosaurids or Tyrannosauroids potentially getting into South America, but the only evidence they have are shed teeth, which are relatively dubious. Nothing close to T-Rex that far south. And T-Rex itself doesn't really get into the most northern part of North America either, right? Nanuqsaurus is a small Tyrannosaurid, but whether that's valid or not is highly debated. Some people just think it's an Albertosaurus that got a little bit further north, and maybe you have them and it's closely related to those. That's still really uncertain. So T-Rex itself doesn't even seem to get really, really far north. It seems to be in kind of this threshold of kind of just barely into Canada, the north or the middle part of those provinces, and down through North America for the most part, probably into a little bit of Mexico, but not much further.
Thank you very much. Any other questions here? Please, real quickly. Probably the last question we have available here.
Okay, my name is Bill, and I'm going to give you a quickie. And basically, I'm going to give a little bit of background. My background's in engineering. And so when I look at the drawings of, for instance, a two-legged, call it a dinosaur because I don't have the names, my instant reaction is, that thing's not balanced. I see animals with the chest and the head, and they look much, much bigger, massive like than the tail. And so I find that bothersome. And something else that I wonder about, again, kind of a different question, but very close. And that is a recollection that the oxygen level at the time was about 30%. Am I correct there? And
the oxygen level is considered high. It was higher at that.
Yes, correct. Much higher than now. And also, one of the things that I've gleaned, again, I have to say it's off the internet, what the heck, is that the respiratory system in today's birds is very substantially different than the respiratory system in today's mammals. And so I'm tying these things together, high oxygen and a much more efficient respiratory system. And how does that produce a survival advantage that lets these animals grow so big? Am I onto something there, or do you have some other explanation?
I think that certainly could be part of it. So I think that part of the idea around a lot of these animals is that they definitely had bones that were in many ways far lighter than what we realize with a lot of these things. Now, that's because you have a lot of air sacs, you have a lot of areas within the bones that allow them to lighten those things up. So even when you have things like this gigantic animal that seems out of balance, there's other ways to kind of counteract that. And even though I said that tail on that reconstruction of Sue seemed excessively large, there is a fact that the musculature of these is similar to birds, but it also has aspects that we see of in crocodilians. They have a gigantic caudofemoralis muscle. That's a muscle that attaches from the femur and goes back through the tail. But what that does is it allows for a lot of musculature for really fast running, and you can really move that limb back significantly. That's important because that helps counteract a lot of that weight that you're getting up front and allows that to be a little bit more balanced. Now, additionally, birds definitely, they have kind of a two-way system where they're basically getting oxygen and taking in that energy and respiring both in and out. So they basically have a double way of getting a lot more energy out of what they're doing compared to mammals where we just suck in air, utilize it, and then remove that and kind of move forward. So we kind of have a one-way system that is not nearly as efficient. Now, whether that efficiency is for extreme behavior, or whether that efficiency allows them to utilize their energy in a lot better way is up for debate. I would suggest that it probably allows you the latter. So you're utilizing energy in a lot more distinctly confined way. You're far more efficient with that, having more oxygen that can allow for the animals to get a lot more out of this. But part of that can also simply be due to the environment that you're getting. The plant life we have, because it was warmer, you had a lot more plants covering a lot more of the planet than you do now, similar to why things like Antarctica has dinosaurs, has things along those lines. And so chances are you're also getting a lot more resources that's allowing this to happen. So I think that those dinosaurs are becoming more efficient. I think that we still don't have a good handle on exactly what they're able to do for kind of the more extreme levels of energy usage, because the debate of how fast things like T-Rex can move and how much energy you need for that then is something that's still highly discussed. Could it legitimately sprint? Could it just kind of jog-ish, or could it walk really, really quickly as that kind of thing is still debated, and we still don't have a real good handle on that. Some of that comes down to how strong we think the bones are, but some of that's also going to deal with the amount of energy you have available and how you're utilizing that. So yeah, I think that we have a idea on some of those things, but we're still missing a lot of pieces. So I feel like we're still coming up with puzzle pieces, and we don't have everything that's there. So we still need that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
That's fantastic. So thank you so much for attending tonight, Dr. Jasinski. And we appreciate our audience in the Delaware County Institute of Science. And we will have a in-person lecture on March 10th with one of our audience members, I believe, Dr. Lauren Buell, will be presenting in person. So we'll move back to in-person instead of having Zoom lectures. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for coming this evening, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you so much.